Somebody said when they saw the title of this talk, Becoming Ray Ileto, parang becoming John Malkovich. You know, it's like that movie, right? In some ways, it is. It's about questions of transformation, self-transformation. It's about movements from different regions of the mind and different regions of the world. And in some ways, it's also an attempt to think about the relationship between the early work of Ray and the late work of Ray. You know, Edward Said, when he was dying from cancer, famously theorized what he said, late theory, what late theory is like, and how the kinds of stuff you think about at the end of your career has a way of modifying what you thought about at the early part of your career. And the sort of dynamic that emerges is sort of interesting, and I thought I would do that too with regard to it. The paper too also comes out, I should say, of a fellowship we did for him last February at Ateneo. Some of you may have been there and heard the short, condensed version, and very lucky that I had a chance to read the more elaborated, relaxed version of the paper, which I'm very grateful to have a chance to share with you today. So let me start. Let me start with an epigraph from Nietzsche, of course, Nietzsche, where he says it's about this word becoming. What does the word becoming mean? And he says, becoming isn't part of history. History amounts only to a set of preconditions, however recent, that one leaves behind in order to become, that is, to create something new. Right? So this idea of becoming as going beyond history is something I want to talk about later on towards the end of the talk, so just bear that in mind. So let me start. Reynaldo Ileto is fond of telling a story about the genesis of his book, Passion and Revolution, Popular Movements in the Philippines, 1840 to 1910. While it is a revised version of his 1973 Cornell dissertation, the seeds for the book were actually planted in the course of his first overseas trip in 1965. His Chinese mestiza grandmother, who had lived through the revolution against Spain and the American and Japanese occupations, took him to Hong Kong and Japan for a 10-day tour. Though unremarkable, the trip, quote, made me question what I was studying at the Ateneo, close quote. It eventually led him, and all these jibes at Ateneo, I'm sure people at UP are going to appreciate it. It eventually led him to shift from engineering and science to the humanities. He even took a course in elementary Nippongo. Along with classes in philosophy, the, quote, melange of humanities subjects formed the core of my thinking for Passion and Revolution, close quote. What is widely acknowledged to be one of the most important works in Philippine studies thus had its origin in foreign sources, first in Japan, then in the United States. Furthermore, its beginnings had nothing to do with Philippine history as such, but rather lay outside of it in the humanities, Western philosophy, and even the Japanese language. Thus the striking irony of Passion and Revolution, that its meticulous concern for illuminating indigenous ideas of power, structures of consciousness, and notions of futurity comes through only from a position and perspective that is outside of the native and the national. Similarly, the vernacular specificity of Tagalog ideas, such as awa, iwanag, damay, and so forth, become understandable only through its explication in English. Indeed, Ray admits that because he grew up, like most middle and upper-class Filipinos of his generation, speaking English at home and in school, his grasp of Tagalog was weak. In his Batangueña wife, Yuli Carandang, he found a kind of translator, what he called a, quote, living dictionary of Tagalog. Her knowledge of the language helped Ray understand the documents he read. Spending a year living with Luli's family in Tanawan, Batangas, while doing research for his dissertation, further sharpened Ray's grasp of Tagalog. For Ray, then, the mother tongue, Tagalog, is actually an other tongue, while his alien language, English, is far more familiar and intimate. While Passion, the book, privileges the semantic power of the vernacular, it is the second tongue, English, that makes the first legible. Right? So the conditions for writing the Passion is already a condition of translation. He's already always translating. Even from the first moment he thinks about the Passion, he's already thinking about it in English, but he's thinking about it in relation to Tagalog. He's always translated. While the Passion was conceptualized and written outside the Philippines, Ray makes very clear, and this is also a really interesting question, right? I mean, this is something we can talk about later. Could the Passion have been written inside the Philippines, right? At the time when he was writing, right? I mean, what would he have written if he had chosen to remain in the Philippines rather than come to the United States? So, this is a really, I mean, it's like I asked the question myself, could I have written the work I've written if I had chosen to live in the Philippines rather than go outside the United States? And the dynamic of that movement and what happens when you move, what happens to your thinking is something that we can talk about later on. Okay, so while the Passion was conceptualized and written outside of the Philippines, Ray makes very clear who its intended audience is, we Filipinos, as he says. Meaning, of course, English literate, westernized, and in Renato Constantino's terms, because this was, of course, a high point when he's writing the Passion, was the high point of Renato Constantino's influence in the Philippines as well. Renato Constantino's terms, the miseducated and neo-colonized members of a small but vastly influential middle and upper middle class. It is to, quote, modern Filipinos. We're getting feedback. My feedback. It is to the modern Filipinos that Ray directs his study of putatively pre-modern peasant movements in an attempt, perhaps, to disabuse them of their quote miseducation. This project is predicated on recuperating vernacular sources from colonial archives. And now I've lost my mic. Have I lost my mic? No. Okay. This project is predicated on recuperating vernacular sources from colonial archives, examining the obscure history of popular rebellions, recalcitrant nationalisms, and errant communities led by, quote, fanatics, driven by superstition, and to do so while shedding light on the understanding of those, quote, from below. In doing so, he highlights the language of peasants by resituating key Tagalog terms. And this is the major innovation of his book for that particular moment, right? The way in which he posits the language, not so much the people, but the language itself as the agency of history, because it's the language itself that enables people to imagine history in a particular way, right? So it's that moment when you disengage language from people that I think is the key contribution of the Passion. So in doing so, he highlights the language of the peasants by resituating key Tagalog words. Standing amidst the flow of English discourse, Tagalog terms like loob, lakaran, anting-anting, liwanag at dilim appear throughout the text in the original form. In a way, if the Passion was a story, the real heroes of the story are not the peasants, but the words of the peasants, the language of the peasants, not the peasants themselves, right? At least in my opinion. From further intensifying the visibility of Tagalog are the lengthy passages from the Passion text, as well as other accounts by peasant leaders, such as Felipe Salvador, that are reproduced side by side with their English equivalents. The recurring appearance of the original Tagalog words have the effect of interrupting the smooth flow of the English text. They arrest our reading by calling attention to the gap between the two languages. Right? Because if you remember, if you read the Passion, here's the Tagalog text, here's the English text. So you move back and forth between the two. And in the process of moving back and forth between the two, you notice the gap between the two. You notice that each line doesn't exactly translate into the other line. Right? So you're very highly aware. Unlike other studies, where you only see the translation, you don't see the original. Here the original insists on being there. And that's, again, it's a marvelous innovation in this book. In this way, the Tagalog words seem to resist reduction and assimilation into English equivalent, simply because they don't disappear. They're there in print. They don't disappear. Right? And by implication, into colonial and elite categories. In reading Passion, one has the sensation, therefore, of moving between the two languages and the worlds they contain. But one is also conscious of a persistent and unbridgeable rift between the two. This is because the Tagalog terms, although given English approximations, nonetheless remain visible and unchanged. They seem then like proper names as they traverse but do not morph into different languages. Right? This is the nature of the proper name. They said proper names transfer but do not translate. Right? You are Miguel, whether you are speaking English or whether you're speaking French or speaking Tagalog, you still remain Miguel. Miguel is proper precisely because it can transfer from one language, but it need not translate. In their original form, Tagalog words seem to insist on their singularity, giving them a certain agency apart from the claims of English. However, the agency of the vernacular, its capacity to withstand and exceed translation into another tongue, is discernible to us only as long as it remains suspended in English. For it is through English that Ray is able to see in Tagalog words a kind of uncanny power to mobilize a mass of interests and commitments at odds with those of the educated and wealthy ruling classes. In other words, English provides the discursive context within which to see the textual power of Tagalog. So English is like the lens that enables him to see just how powerful Tagalog is. Without English, the power of Tagalog would be lost. But Tagalog's power, in other words, English provides a discursive context within which to see the textual power of Tagalog. But Tagalog's power to resist reduction into English is simultaneously reliant upon the latter's explication. Throughout the book, English and Tagalog are thus less opposed as they are juxtaposed to one another. As the language of American colonial rule and post-war elite nationalism, English furnishes a scaffolding with which to support and therefore make visible the power of Tagalog. But Tagalog needs English, just as English has the capacity to illuminate the power of Tagalog. Bristling in practically every paragraph of the book, Tagalog emerges as a semantic lodestar that forces, quote, us modern Filipinos to rethink the limits as well as necessity of English in conveying a, quote, Filipino past. For Ray, the stakes of the translation project could not be higher. By deciphering the masses' terms for understanding and acting upon their given conditions, we can better decide on the direction of, quote, social reform. This is what he writes. He says, quote, we can either further accelerate the demise of the backward ways of thinking, of their backward ways of thinking, in order to pave the way for the new, or we can graft modern ideas into traditional modes of thought. Whatever our strategy may be, it is necessary that we first understand how the, quote, traditional mind operates, particularly in relation to questions of change. This book aims to help bring about this understanding. Close quote. God, the students keep on coming. Yeah, it's like this flood. Come on in. So here we arrive at a curious contradiction. Okay? Curious contradiction. The implicit political aim of the book, which is to contribute to social reforms. Remember, he's writing this in the 70s, heart of martial law, in the wake of the student movement, etc., etc. So, to contribute to social reform in a time of growing unrest and recurring class warfare in the Philippines, right? This implicit political aim assumes that we, the readers and the author of the book, are obligated to understand them, the masses, whose words and acts make up the object of the book's study. And in comprehending the deep structure of their seemingly fanatical actions, we are led to see them as, in fact, rational actors, every bit as human as we are. Right? Thanks to the work of translation, we can come to recognize the other, in this case the present other, as in fact an aspect of ourselves. Rather than accursed others, we can see them as kapatid, or siblings, right? With whom we share a common national bond and with whom we bear a moral obligation. Hearing their words, we take on the duty to reform and therefore rescue them from historical forgetting and therefore social injustices. For historians, those two things come together, right? Why do historians do history? Because for them it's an act of social justice. To remember is to render justice to those who have been forgotten. It is worth noting, however, that though we might sense the other, as akin to ourselves, it is much less certain that the reverse is ever true. That is, that we see ourselves to be like them. So the reverse of that reverse identification hardly ever happens. The political project of reform invariably places us necessarily in a hierarchical relationship with them. It is we who come to understand the traditional man from below, rather than the other way around, from our position above. The social construction, therefore, of the book's readership and the assumptions of its reception, right, is thus at odds with its linguistic features. I'm going to explain why in a second. We, readers, attend to those from below in order to comprehend them and better intervene in their lives without necessarily changing our positions. Right? So, the politics of translation, however, that I tried to illuminate in the earlier part of this paper, moves in a different direction. Right? Where the relationship between English and Tagalog are concerned, very different from the relationship between peasants and the middle class. The relationship between English and Tagalog highlights Tagalog. Now, in this book, English highlights Tagalog in order to give way to it. It defers to Tagalog, acknowledging its capacity to organize, experience, and actualize a world steeped in the ethos, for example, of utang na loob, kalayaan, damayan, hiya, and so forth. From the perspective of language, then, the great accomplishment of Pasión is not only to chronicle those historical moments when social hierarchy was periodically challenged, but also when linguistic hierarchy was loosened. In fact, the book enacts this very linguistic movement. It shows how the translation of Tagalog into English leads not to the substitution of one for the other, but to the decisive displacement of the latter's hegemony, English, to speak for and about the former. In contrast, from the perspective of readers, translation also becomes a way of consolidating social hierarchy, reinforcing our position as English literate Filipinos to represent and intervene into the lives of those other Filipinos inhabiting largely vernacular worlds. Put differently, whereas English posits the power of Tagalog to make the world, the English literate author and readers posit their power to understand and therefore remake the world of Tagalog speakers. Right? There's really different politics as it's playing. Translation therefore produces discrepant effects, leveling linguistic hierarchy at one moment, right? Hierarchy between English and Tagalog, only to shore up class inequality in the next. This tendency, at once contradictory and productive of certain possibilities, is perhaps inherent in translation, especially in the case of the Philippines, as I have tried to illustrate elsewhere, for example, in Tracking Colonialism, my first book. It also manifests itself in other aspects of Ray's work. We see this, for example, in his autobiographical writings. In the course of Ray's later post-Pasión career, we can discern an intriguing turn to the autobiographical. And this is what I want to move into. Consciously inserting himself into his texts, Ray, in his later writings, has sought to evoke his milieu as a way of accounting for his particular approach to and understanding of such topics as popular movements, contemporary politics, comparative imperial legacies of Spain, the United States, and Japan. By objectifying the social conditions of his work, Ray has sought to establish his own life as the context against which a series of historical topics are read and interpreted. Whether it is writing about the post-war development of Southeast Asian studies, the preface to the Japanese translation of Pasión, or more recently, the American Empire from the perspective of his father's experience in the 1930s and the 1950s compared to his own experience in the 1960s and the 1970s, Ray's use of autobiography seems to mark a departure from the linguistic concerns of his earlier work. Only rarely does it bring up questions of language and translation, and only then as an adjunct to the more pressing questions of self-transformation amid changing geopolitical and material conditions. In the earlier work, the fetish quality of the vernacular to produce and not simply represent the world in which it figured was a major motif. In the later writings, however, Ray seems to sidestep the vernacular world in favor of tracing the self's movements outside and around it. Yet there is, I think, a way to see in the later texts a retracing and working through of the unresolved tensions between the linguistic and the social that remains characteristic of his earlier work in the Passion. And let me suggest how this happens. How then do we think of autobiography in the context of Ray's work? And the question of autobiography is really a tough genre for historians. And I think for anybody else for that matter, it's a really acute genre. Before proceeding any further, I should make it clear that the remarks that follow do not make up a historically accurate, if there is any such thing, account of Ray in all his worldly complexity. It is rather a close reading of Ray's construction of Ray, the textualization of his own life, as it were, which, after all, is what constitutes autobiography. At no point in my reading, therefore, do I refer to the real Ray, whose singularity doubtless exceeds even his own textualization, but only to the figurative Ray, right? The Ray in quotes, who emerges from his own writings. In other words, the Ray who has fictionalized himself into his own work, right? Selective, partial, and retrospectively regarded from shifting perspectives and interests, autobiographical writing tends to share some of the elements of fiction. If, by fiction, we mean the imaginative recreation of a world related to, but always at a tangent from the real one we inhabit. We can think of Ray's autobiography then in this way, as a documentation of a life that, seen from the vanishing point of the present, necessarily entails the work of imaginative recuperation. Autobiography is a self-conscious reckoning with one's own past, thus stands midway between the genres of history and literature. And that's what's fascinating about autobiography. It's always in between different genres. It's very difficult to classify exactly what autobiography is. In the writing of the self, in both senses of the genitive, right? The genitive of, the empirical and the fictional are inextricably bound. So how then does autobiography work in Ray's writings? It does so in two related ways: as an anti-imperialist critique and as nationalist affirmation. In this sense, we can think of Ray as part of a long line of Filipino thinkers, from Rizal to Lubini, from Aguinaldo to Recto, from Constantino to De La Costa. Indeed, these writers serve as the ethico-political points of references in Ray's work. Even as his historiographic and theoretical orientation owes more to his British and American teachers at Cornell and the European philosophers he read at Ateneo. We can see Ray's affiliation with his nationalist generation in one of his most oft-repeated stories about his graduate student days at Cornell. He tells of his initial encounter with Professor Oliver Walters, between 1915 and 2000, who was also my teacher. I mean, Ray was 10 years ahead of me, so in many ways, many of these tracks that he laid out, I also followed from Ateneo all the way to Cornell. And Walters was also my professor. Oliver Walters, who was perhaps one of the most important authorities on early Southeast Asian history at that time. Ray recalls how his former British colonial official, who had been involved in suppressing the communist insurgency in Malaya during the emergency, sternly warned the young Filipino student in 1967 against writing nationalist history. Quote, Walters reached towards the shelf behind him and pulled out a book by a certain Teodoro Agoncillo titled A History of the Filipino People. And then he warned me in no uncertain terms, quote, do not write like Agoncillo. I was taken aback. I didn't even know who Agoncillo was, having studied undergraduate history at the Ateneo. Here, the professor tells the student what not to write. Learning begins with a negative injunction. Forbidden to write like Agoncillo, Ray nonetheless comes to develop a deep, albeit critical appreciation of his work. He is especially captivated by Agoncillo's book on the Katipunan, the revolt of the masses. The figure of Andres Bonifacio, as it emerged in the book, gives Ray a glimmer of what his dissertation would be about. The professor's no thus lays the groundwork for the student's yes. It stirs the student's interest precisely towards what he was barred from. Setting aside this prohibition, his disobedience proves to be productive. He discovers a thesis topic and writes what would become an astonishingly significant book that years later would place his professor in a position of having to defer to him in admiration. Like he talks about years later, Walter says, "Oh, congratulations, this is a terrific book." In this sense, in this scene of transgression, the lowly brown student initially accedes to, but eventually dispenses with, the order of the white professor. Autobiography allows Ray to imagine himself divided into two: a younger, naive I, who does not know what he is even not supposed to know, and an older, more knowledgeable I, who looks back in amusement and pride at how the former overcomes his own ignorance and insecurity. He does so by engaging in a dialectical struggle with his professor and eventually prevails, even as he conserves the authority of the former, making it into an aspect of his own self. The young Ray becomes a professor himself, much admired and cited like the older Walters. Relaying the story to us here today allows the older Ray of the future to recuperate and safeguard the memory of the younger Ray for a readership in the present. As readers and listeners of the story, we come to register and validate the unification and consolidation of the divided self into a self-authorizing figure. It's that transition. It's key, right? He starts out being divided and then unified and then self-authorizing, right? He becomes father to himself, so to speak. He becomes his own authority. He doesn't need somebody else to authorize him. Self-authorizing figure, who therefore, and the proof of the self-authorizing figure is he gets to sign his name, Ronaldo Ileto, as the author of his books across space and time. In discovering Agoncillo's revolt, Ray, like Bonifacio before him, engages in a series of other revolts against a number of authority figures, right? Because revolution is constant theme in his work. Once at Cornell, he rebels not only against Walters, but also against the Jesuit fathers who, quote, had hidden from me knowledge of the student movements at the University of the Philippines, as well as Agoncillo's nationalist history. Intrigued by the idea of, quote, the unfinished revolution in the book of Agoncillo, Ray remarks how, quote, as a student of the Ateneo, I don't think I ever became aware of this notion, close quote. In reading Agoncillo, Ray not only finds, quote, inspiration for his dissertation, he also, quote, wakes up from the ideological slumber induced by the Jesuit fathers. Finally, in chapter 1 of this book, Ray manages to take aim even at Agoncillo himself. While acknowledging the importance of revolt in the writing of the Passion, Ray nonetheless remarks that something is missing from Agoncillo's book. Quote, although I found the story of the Katipunan and his Supremo Bonifacio vividly reconstructed by Agoncillo, I remained intrigued by the relationship of the title to the body of the book. The physical involvement, revolt of the masses, right? The physical involvement of the masses in the revolution is pretty clear. But how did they actually perceive, in terms of their own experience, the ideas of nationalism and revolution brought from the West by the Ilustrados? Agoncillo assumes to all those who engaged in the revolution, the meaning of independence was the same: separation from Spain and the building of a sovereign Philippine nation. Close quote. So the title of the book, which is to say its head, seems to be at odds with its body. It names one thing but refers to another. Ray regards this gap as a shortcoming on Agoncillo's part, one that he shares with other Ilustrado thinkers. For while Agoncillo seeks to speak of the masses, he in fact fails to hear them, and, like his predecessors, imposes his interpretation of events on them instead. The masses, avowed agents of the revolution, end up unheard. Passion, insofar as it seeks to, quote, simply let Bonifacio and the Katipunan speak to us, close quote, corrects the shortcomings of this other father figure. Ray, therefore, acknowledges his debt to Agoncillo's book, simultaneously negating and subsuming it as something that his own book will one day come to surpass. Containing Agoncillo, the name as well as the work, within the boundaries of his own work, leads Ray to engage in yet another dramatic struggle, this time with his biological father. Aside from setting him apart from Walters and the Jesuits, Ray writes that, quote, Agoncillo also opened up an ideological rift between him and his father, Rafael Ileto, lived 1920 to 2003. In his yet-to-be-published essay, quote, Father and Son in the Embrace of Uncle Sam, close quote, which is coming out in his new book that's about to appear from Ateneo. Ray writes about his father in great detail. He tracks the different ways in which he and his father encountered the American Empire as they traveled from the Philippines to study in the United States. Throughout the essay, Ray contrasts his father's response from his. Whereas the father enthusiastically participated in the defense of the American Empire against its enemies in the 1940s through the 1980s, the son, arriving in the midst of the turbulent 1960s, was deeply skeptical of imperial claims that the U.S. was a benevolent and a civilizing force. Reflecting the generational divide between Filipinos who grew up under U.S. and Japanese occupation and those who came of age in the post-colonial era, Ray's account of his life is a stark contrast to his father's. It is a stance that is perhaps not atypical of many Filipino post-colonials, indeed, of entire generations of post-colonials in many other places in the world, growing up in an era of decolonization and dissent. In what follows, I want to trace the dynamics of the relationship, or what it might say about the varying construction of nationhood on one hand, and the unresolved issues between language and social hierarchy that we saw in the Passion and Revolution on the other. Educated at West Point, Rafael Ileto was lauded for his wartime heroics against the Japanese as part of the combined Filipino-American liberation forces led by General Douglas MacArthur. He would go on to play important roles in the making of post-war Philippines as one of the leaders of the counter-insurgency war against the Hawks in the 1960s, then serving in the administration of several presidents, including, of course, Cory Aquino. Steeped in the ideology of anti-communism, General Ileto was deeply suspicious of anything remotely associated with the left. Agoncillo, as Ray points out, had been sympathetic to the Hawks, a communist-aligned peasant movement that began as an anti-Japanese guerrilla resistance movement during World War II and escalated into an anti-republic rebellion, mostly focused in central Luzon until the early 1950s. This was one reason why the publication of Revolt of the Masses was initially blocked by the Committee of Un-Filipino Activities, led by no less than Ramon Magsaysay. Quote, to my father, who was working for the Philippine intelligence in the 1960s, the Revolt of the Masses was just another subversive book that helped spread communist ideas in school, close quote. Aggravating Ray's alienation from his father was his son's decision to teach at the University of the Philippines, which his father, quote, considered the hotbed of communism, close quote. Worse, in 1978, Ray traveled to Red China with a group of Filipino historians, quote, which was a bit too much for my father, close quote. Beginning with the proper name Agoncillo, the son finds a way to challenge and eventually exceed his father, as he did with his Cornell and Ateneo professors. He escapes their influence and overcomes their authority after waking up to a certain truths that had been kept from him. Banking on Agoncillo's name and work, he writes his dissertation and produces a book that comes to establish his name for posterity, distinguishing it from his better-known followers. In the battle of proper names, Reynaldo Ileto, the product of split selves that comes to be united through the mediation of another proper name, Teodoro Agoncillo, survives Rafael Ileto into the future. Let us take a closer look at the father's name as that which organizes the difference between father and son. It's a really interesting story about the dad's name. Ray calls attention to the shifts in Rafael's name as he moves from humble provincial beginnings in Nueva Ecija to positions of metropolitan prominence as a graduate of the Philippine Military Academy in 1939, then as a graduate of West Point in 1943. This journey from periphery to the center of the American Empire brought about a radical transformation in his father's identity. The change was most palpably registered in his father's name. Rafael Ileto was known as Apeng in the Philippines, but his efforts to, quote, belong to America culminated in a name change, close quote, while he was at West Point. At first, quote, they started calling him Ralph. But since Ralph was already the name of a roommate, they settled for a nickname that he would carry for the rest of his life, Rocky. As Rocky, Rafael sought to assimilate into, quote, the American dream. At a time of intense racial wars, both within Jim Crow America and beyond, in the Pacific War against Japan, Rocky played lacrosse and learned how to box, often defeating much larger, whiter opponents. He worked hard to improve his English and, quote, dreamed of escorting white girls to dances, close quote. He even became an honorary citizen of the small Missouri town he visited regularly as a guest of his roommate and with whose sister he exchanged numerous letters. In contrast, Reynaldo Ileto was always known as Reynaldo Ileto, or Ray for short. While his father came to the United States as a bachelor, desiring white girls, Ray arrived in Ithaca, accompanied by his Filipino bride of 2 months, Luli Carandang. Rocky moved in a world that was overwhelmingly white and segregated, where he struggled with his English and sought to establish himself as the physical and intellectual equal of any man. As a graduate student in upstate New York, Ray became even more tied to the Philippines at home. Right? So they moved in completely opposite directions. Coming to America meant learning, or rather relearning Tagalog, given his ready fluency in English. He counted among his friends many Asian and Filipino students, including, of course, Joel Wacamora, who was at Cornell at that time. And that's another story. While his white friends were invariably fellow students involved in anti-war movements and largely sympathetic to Asian aspirations, as opposed to American ambitions. Where Rocky was anxious to assimilate into the American dream, Ray, steeped in the Americanized culture of post-war Philippines, found himself awakening to an American nightmare of imperialist warfare and racial strife. Rarely venturing beyond the confines of Ithaca to make friends with other Americans the way his father had done, Ray, as if prefiguring the language of the Passion, recoiled from what he called, quote, the glitter of empire, the false promises and the contradictions between myths and realities. I felt no desire to belong to America outside of Cornell. On the one hand, the father moved from Tagalog to English to the point of speaking only English to his children in their home. He took on a succession of names going from Apeng to Ralph to Rocky as he traveled from Nueva Ecija to America. The son, on the other hand, found himself imaginatively returning to the Philippines as he physically moved to America, steadfastly remaining foreign in a foreign setting. He embraced the anti-imperialism of his campus milieu and affirmed what retrospectively he came to reckon as his obscured nationalist roots. Rocky's nationalism consisted of serving the empire in the belief that he was then furthering the interests of his people. Contrast this with Ray's nationalism, which begins with the experience of, quote, awakening, of coming to see the real, quote, light or liwanag of truth behind the deceiving glitter represented by the very promises that his own father had subscribed to. Recalling Renato Constantino's analysis of post-war Philippine society, Rocky and Ray were exemplars of colonial, quote, miseducation. But there were important differences. The father's rite of passage to America transformed him into a, quote, model soldier of America's empire. Whereas the son's journey to Ithaca not only turned him against the empire, but also turned him towards the Philippines, and even more important, towards Tagalog. In the process of becoming something other than they were, it is in the process of becoming something other than they were that we can see the connection between translation and autobiography. As we have seen, autobiography splits the self into two I's along a temporal axis. A future I, encapsulating and speaking for the past I, translating both into a narrative available to a third term, the addressee, who of course is the present reader or listener. We saw this in Ray's story of his encounter with Walters at Cornell. But autobiography also depends on the biography of another, right? So you have autobiography, but then you need the biography of another, who is perhaps less enlightened, more gullible, and not quite modern, against which the self establishes itself to be better educated, more attuned to the world, and more in touch with the truth. This is what we've seen in Ray's use of his father's biography as the backdrop for his own life's story. Key to the difference between father and son was the matter of proper names. Rafael, known as Apeng, is translated into Rocky, who is then enfolded into the designs of empire. Ray, however, remains Ray. His proper name continues to be what it had always been. Unlike the father, the son's name remains unchanged. It transfers from one country to another, from one language to another, but it does not translate. It crosses boundaries while remaining outside of and distinct from the languages and cultures that lay on either side of the divide. Like the untranslated Tagalog words that pulsate within the fabric of Passion and Revolution, Ray, the name, remains resistant to the seductions of empire, escaping the totality of its embrace. The autobiographical vignettes establish a precedent for the resistance of proper names. In Ray's case, the invocation of Agoncillo, the name of Agoncillo, and later on Bonifacio, serve as talismanic weapons with which to ward off attempts to translate and reduce their lives and works into oblivion. In contrast, the history of his father's name indicates how contingent and fragile such resistance can be. As the name ceases to be, quote, proper altogether and becomes a common marker of another power alien to the self. Ray writes about his father, he later says, as a way of simultaneously criticizing and paying tribute to him. He wants to, quote, show his love and gratitude without being colonized by his values. The son emerges as one who distinguishes himself from his origin, yet remains faithful to it. He excavates Apeng underneath Rocky in the desire to redefine the life of Rafael, en route to taking stock of his own. That is, he retranslates his father's name into its putatively proper native context. Just as in the Passion, Ray uncovers the obscured history and hidden powers of the vernacular amidst layers of English, so too does he rescue, as it were, the vernacular substrate underneath the Americanized surface of his father's name. The irony, of course, is that the significance of the Tagalog Apeng is as the hidden meaning of the Spanish Rafael resonates only to the extent that it can be read, translated, if you will, from the American Rocky. Right? So the three things still have to remain related in some ways. There is, however, one final twist in the battle of proper names, and this is what I want to talk about in conclusion. One last twist. The task of translating his father's life in relation to his own turns out to be something carried out for the sake of his mother, Olga Clemenia. Ray writes at the end of his essay, quote, "In the latter part of their marriage, my mother herself adopted a softly critical stance towards her husband. She would agree with much of what I've said here. I have only merely given voice to her unarticulated sentiments. She is the absent presence throughout this narrative of father and son in the embrace of empire." This sudden invocation of the mother brings us back to the problem of address I had mentioned earlier in relation to the Passion and Revolution. Just as the author addresses us about them, the peasants from below, whose history must be heard and understood if they are to become part of our nation, so in his autobiography he writes of himself and his father in order to, quote, give voice to his mother. It is her, quote, absent presence that, like the Holy Ghost, hovers over the story of the father and the son. By subsuming the father's history, the son makes the mother heard, or at least makes known her, quote, unarticulated sentiments. The son speaks of and for the mother, just as the author speaks of and for the, quote, inarticulate masses, translating their language into something comprehensible to us. Olga, like the peasants, is not so much voiceless or dumb, but blocked from speaking. Unblocking their speech, the author's son reveals them to be the secret authors of history, as well as his own narratives. The mother, who of course is the first other, right? If you just take off the M. The mother stands as the repressed origin of the two men's lives, just as peasant movements exist as the quote, underside of Philippine history. That is to say, as the permanent possibility of class warfare and revolutionary upheaval itself. However, there is also an important difference between the peasants and the mother. They're not just conflated, they're not just the same. While the peasants are made strikingly visible and readily comprehensible within the context of nationalist history, the mother remains radically other in relation to the stories of father and son. The mother is a heterogeneous element in the son's story, one whose centrality is belatedly acknowledged only to be withdrawn. She occupies two positions: as the absent you who receives and registers Gray's stories beyond the grave, and as the object of the story whose presence is assumed but remains repressed. Silent witness and voiceless interlocutor, the mother remains untouched and yet seems to be in touch with everything else. While various father figures are challenged and subsumed in Gray's account, Olga Clemenia remains between languages and proper names, circulating between men and their histories, yet barely visible in their autobiographies. She is what Nietzsche might have described as, quote, the historical, which amounts to, quote, only to a set of preconditions, however recent, that one leaves behind in order to become, that is, to create something new, close quote. Becoming a man like Ray Ileto or Rocky Ileto required leaving behind the very history that made it possible for something new to emerge. But it also meant refiguring that history as a mother, for example, or as Inang Bayan, to whom one returns and whose behalf one speaks, and in no less than in one's mother tongue, at once lost and found. In the name of the Father and the Son, women emerge as ghostly presences, analogous to that other nation imagined by us as the mass of peasants excluded from nationalist historiography. Whether it is the mother silently agreeing with the son's critique of the father, or the wife whose fluency in the vernacular makes her an essential supplement to the work of the author, women come to occupy an ambiguous place in both the historical and autobiographical texts. Like the masses, they are both central and peripheral. As in Pasión, so in the autobiographical writings, the author and those he addresses become who they are by virtue of having subsumed and incorporated the other, who they are not. Seeking to broaden the basis of nationhood and deepen the personal stakes in its imagining, both the book and the autobiography also convert nationalism into a series of stories about self-alienation and its overcoming. That process of overcoming entails the rescue of those below, of those whose names are barely heard, who have been silenced and set aside. Positioned as the privileged agents for granting agency to those below, the son, the author, and readers from the upper reaches of a national hierarchy that, as a matter of course, are heirs to a highly, Positioned as the privileged agents for granting agency to those below, the son, author, and readers form the upper reaches of a national hierarchy that, as a matter of course, are heirs to a highly gendered colonial history. By contrast, the linguistic play evinced in Pasión and Revolution between Tagalog and English, as I've suggested, speak to the possibility of leveling hierarchy. So rather than recreate hierarchy, levels hierarchy. Autobiography is always about the recreation of hierarchy. Ray gives a compelling explication in English of peasant movements as political projects intimately tied to ethical norms sustained by a messianic sense of history. But in doing so, he also makes clear that the specificity of their thoughts and actions can be grasped only in and through Tagalog. The juxtaposition of the two languages, English and Tagalog, thus allows for the opening of worlds hitherto invisible to, quote, us. The autobiography, however, moves in a different direction. Recounting life as a series of struggles against authority figures, the autobiography betrays an investment in hierarchy, whether by way of a self, commemorating an absent presence, the young I, the silent mother, or a self overcoming the other that comes before it, in all senses of that word, whether it be a professor, another author, or one's own father. There is then the sense that autobiography forecloses the possibilities raised in the Pasión. While the book speaks of a kind of unfinished social revolution evinced on the level of language and translation, the autobiography deploys a gendered optic that conventionalizes the process of transformation, substituting social revolution with a narrative of generational masculine succession. Now, let me end, and this is truly the end, let me end with a final autobiographical note that modulates and qualifies my observations above. It was around 1976 when I first encountered Ray Ileto's work as an undergraduate student majoring in history in the Ateneo. It was in the Philippine history class of the Jesuit historian John Schumacher that I first read Ray's thesis. At that time it was still a thesis. I remember becoming so excited at what seemed to be an entirely novel approach to studying the revolution, which is to say, of studying the newness of what was new, that I borrowed the thesis from the library and paid a typist to make a facsimile copy, because at that time it was cheaper to have someone type it than to have it Xerox. Xerox was much more expensive. So I paid a typist to make a facsimile copy, which at that time was actually cheaper than getting it Xerox. I had the facsimile bound just like a thesis. On the cover was the title, Pasión and the Interpretation of Change in Tagalog Society, which was the title of his thesis. And underneath it appeared my name, Vicente Rafael, inadvertently placed by the typist. It was as if in having Ray's thesis copied, his name had been erased to make way for mine. The desire to appropriate Pasión, to bring it up close, so close as to blur the identity between the author and the reader, or I should say the difference between the author and the reader, has been the ongoing experience I've had with Ray's book. In fact, much of what I have since written has to some extent leaned on Ray's ideas, at times peeling away from them, at others displacing and disfiguring them for other uses. I always return to Ray's work whenever I'm not sure how to think about the vernacular analog for power and pity, reciprocity and revenge, shame and sovereignty, and so forth. Pasión and revolution is like a country I grew up in. One could travel abroad, read other books, and dwell in the shade of other ideas. But so long as I thought about the Philippines, I found myself meandering back, sooner or later, to the passages of Ray's work. It was Pasión that first gave me a sense of the imaginative possibilities and political salience of the vernacular, especially when deployed beside, rather than merely subsumed by, English language historiography. By delineating the power of the vernacular, Ray complicates and detains every attempt to translate Tagalog ideas into English. At the same time, he questions the adequacy of English terms to substitute for the complexity of Tagalog. Reading as the experience of translation, translation as the experience of being detained and stranded between languages, and detention as the experience of attending patiently, at times joyfully, to the play of meanings and the expectation of something to come. These are the enduring lessons I've learned and continue to learn from Ray's work. Thank you.